So we record these sessions. If you have someone in your office or you know of someone who was unable to attend, these will be posted to the NCDEA.us website under our training category, along with the materials that the presenters present. So you'll have access to those after the fact if you want to go back, listen again, if you want to share that with employees or counterparts across your states, feel free to do so. NCDEA is one of our primary missions is to promote professional development amongst conservation district employees. And after a strategic planning process, we heard from employees across the country that they were looking for additional trainings and outreach opportunities. And so this is our attempt to provide some additional opportunities for a wide variety of topics. We've done some on education. We have talked about social media best practices. We're doing grants. Next month, we'll be talking about kind of thinking outside the box for funding sources for your districts. So we have a couple of districts lined up who have some pretty unique partnerships that allows them to fund employees and operations within their districts. The webinars are the fourth Wednesday of the month. At 11 o'clock Central. And like I said, we record them all so you can go back after the fact and watch them. So welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you. We're going to start off today with Chloe Hundelt from the National Association of Conservation Districts. She's a grant specialist with NACD. So I'll let you introduce yourself a little more, Chloe, and let you get started.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. My name is Chloe Hundelt. So yes, I am a grant specialist for NACD. So I was invited to give this presentation to give an overview of some basic grants management resources and concepts. I'm going to do my best to cover the topics that I get questions about the most. And then we're also going to have one of our grantees give some examples, real world examples of how they apply these methods in their own grant tracking. So that will be from one of our district managers, Erin Kilcullen. So when I get to that point, I'll pass it over to her as well. But I can get started. So just to go over again what we'll cover in this presentation, I'm going to go over some basics of grant tracking and documentation, cost tracking, different resources that you might use for compliance on your grant, and again, just some basic grants management concepts. I'm always happy to answer questions. I have my contact information at the end as well. Then we'll go over some lessons learned with Erin, who will share some of her budget spreadsheets so that you can kind of see a real world application of these concepts. And then lastly, I'll just briefly go over some of the opportunities for grants with NACD that are either available now or will be coming available soon. So first, I'll give a brief introduction to grants management. And the most important resource that we can use when we're looking at managing federal grant funding is the Code of Federal Regulations, also known as Uniform Guidance. And the section that is relevant to grants is the 2 CFR 200. So this is a resource that is basically a federally developed guidance that gives best practices for managing your grants. And typically federal grants are going to follow these rules unless otherwise stipulated. So it's important to understand how to find the guidance, what it will do for you, and how to use it. So Uniform Guidance, it streamlines all these administrative requirements that come with getting federal funding. So that includes things like cost principles and audit requirements. So I kind of pulled out what I feel are the most important sections for grants management, specifically with the kind of grants that NACD offers, but probably just in general, for federal grants as well. So subpart A covers all the acronyms and the definitions that are used in 2 CFR 200. So there are a lot of acronyms. There is a lot of jargon in this guidance. And so anytime that you're not sure what the guidance is referring to, you can always come back to that section. Subpart D goes over the post-award requirements. So when you receive a grant, it provides the requirements for compliance for receiving that funding. So there's specific standards for financial and program management for your grant funding. There's also standards for procurement of services like contracts, procurement of equipment, equipment management. So if you purchase equipment with those funds, how you are required to then manage and document your equipment. And then record keeping. So there are requirements for how long you have to maintain records for your grant, what kind of records you have to maintain in order to be in compliance with the grant. Because if you are receiving federal funding, you're also liable to provide any information in the event that there is an audit and your agency that funded the grant comes back to you and is saying, I need this documentation. You'll be required to provide that. Subpart E goes over cost principles, so basic guidelines for determining what is allowable. Every agency has different specific things that are not allowable versus what is allowable. So that's something that you would have to work with your agency, but there are some general not allowable costs and general costs that are allowable. So just how to determine whether a cost is allowable on a grant. And then also classifying direct and indirect costs, which I am going to get more in depth on because I get a lot of questions about indirect costs. So I thought that might be helpful to talk about today. And then subpart F goes over audit requirements. So the requirements for non-federal entities receiving federal funding for compliance with an audit requirement. And then also the requirement to have an audit, which is if your organization is receiving $750,000 or more in federal funding, then you are required to get a single audit. So this is the website. I have a link here. I believe we can share these slides. Happy to share this PDF. But I think the most important piece that I kind of highlighted here is the search function. So on top, there's a general search, but that will search the entire Code of Federal Regulations. Whereas if you use the search function down here, it's only going to search the section that you're in. And so that's where you want to go. If you're looking for something particular in the uniform guidance, you can use this search function here. That's circled in red to find the information that you're looking for. But anybody can access this. It's all available online. And this is kind of like the holy grail of your grants management resources because this is the federal guidelines. So let's talk a little bit about direct and indirect costs. Like I said, I feel like this is probably one of the hottest topics that I get questions about. So thinking about a direct cost, this is a cost that can be specifically identified with a particular project or program. So for example, personnel hours for a project manager who is working directly on project implementation. The portion of their salary that covers the hours that they will be working on this project is a direct cost. If you're purchasing supplies for the project, that would be a direct cost. Let's see, materials used solely for the project. I already said that. And then another example would be travel expenses. So a lot of our conservation grants have a lot of site visits required. Travel expenses to those site visits would be considered a direct cost. So the key here is that it's easy to attribute that cost to a specific objective. and that it's directly linked to the outcome of the project. So you say, I have to make these site visits because I have to reach this number of producers. And so in order to reach this number of producers, I have to pay for mileage on my car. That's a direct link to a project outcome. Indirect costs are the costs that your organizations will incur for common or joint objectives that are not easily identified with a particular project or a program. So these are typically an administrative salary. So somebody who does things like payroll, maybe for general office supplies, things that the whole office uses, utilities, so your electric bill for your office space, or rent for your office space. So these are kind of the costs that sometimes they're called overhead. They're costs that are benefiting the project, but not directly. So they're not as easily identifiable with a specific project outcome. So again, the key part is they are not easily attributable to a single cost objective, and that they will support multiple projects or activities of your organization. Okay, so I want to also talk a little bit about administrative costs. So this is where things get tricky, and I find this a lot as well with especially our technical assistance grants. So I mentioned administrative staff can often be an indirect cost. However, there is administrative costs that can be considered direct costs. So a project-specific administrative staff effort, so for example, a project coordinator, that can be considered a direct cost. The time that somebody is taking to complete a report for the funding agency, that is directly attributable to project outcomes because completing those reports are a requirement of your grant. Any project management staff hours could be a direct cost. Data entry, financial reporting specifically for the grant. This is why kind of keeping time of how much that someone is dedicating to the project is important when you're trying to figure out what hours can be attributed directly to the grant versus what is more of an indirect cost. So, for example, if you have to collect data and compile data for outcomes tracking, so for your key performance indicators, your metrics for the grant, that would be considered a direct cost, the person who's doing that data entry or the person who is gathering that financial information specifically for the grant. That can be a direct cost. So again, it's identifiable with a specific project or grant, and that you can document the hours that they worked on that specific project, and you can justify why it is necessary in order to complete that grant. Administrative costs as indirect costs are for those more general administrative staff time. So somebody who's a receptionist at the front desk, that is not directly attributable to that project. However, it's somebody that is still benefiting your organization as a whole. That would fall under an indirect cost. Somebody who's an office manager, so somebody who orders supplies for your office, keeps the lights on, that kind of stuff, indirect cost. General financial and accounting personnel, I had mentioned payroll as one of those. So payroll staff, maybe your HR team, IT support, maintenance staff. Those are examples of administrative staff that's an indirect cost. So I think the key here I was trying to emphasize is that administrative costs are not blanket indirect. Occasionally, administrative costs can be direct if they are attributable directly to the grant. Just let me know if you have any questions. I know I'm covering a lot, and I feel like I can talk about this stuff for a while, and then to me it makes perfect sense, but perhaps to someone else it doesn't make any sense. So I'm happy to clarify. Okay, so moving on from the direct and indirect discussion, Let's talk a little bit about basic financial tracking. So just some best practices when you're trying to track spending on a grant. It's important to have a system in place. I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but it's not always the case that our smaller grantees have had a need to establish a tracking system for their expenditures. So you can use something as simple as an Excel workbook, or perhaps you purchase a software like QuickBooks, but having some kind of system in place is extremely important. There's also an option that you could have separate bank accounts specifically for each grant. So with NCDEA grants, for example, we operate on direct deposit. So if you had one account that was for a grant with NCDEA, you would provide us with that ACH information. And that way, when we pay you for that grant, it's going into that account. And so there's no way to kind of mix up funds between other projects or your just your general fund or things like that. That's one other option for making tracking easier. It's important to work with the approved budget from your proposal as your starting point. So when you submit a grant proposal, you're required to submit a budget. Part of the uniform guidance are the thresholds for when you need to get approvals when you make changes on that budget. So it's important that you are tracking from that budget. So you're seeing what you proposed, and then you're looking at what you're actually spending so that you can keep your funder aware of how the project is actually playing out in reality. And so also knowing when it's time to seek approval. Just a tidbit, typically there's a 10% threshold. So if you want to move funds across budget categories, in order to trigger the need to get approval, it's a 10% of the total grant. So let's say you had a $100,000 grant, $10,000 would be the threshold if you want to move $10,000 across the budget categories. So you want to track your expenditures. So anytime that you're spending grant funds, whether you're working on an advance basis or a reimbursement basis, if you're spending funds that are specifically for the project, you'll have to track that. So record all those transactions right away. It's easier to do it if you're just doing it as you go rather than trying to go back and remember what you spent. Make sure that you're categorizing your expenses based on the budget that you presented. So is this a personnel cost? Is this a materials and supplies cost? Is this a travel cost? Like categorizing as you go as well. And then regularly comparing what you're actually spending to the approved budget so that you can identify those variances and be very aware of if you're ever triggering the need for approval. And keeping detailed records as part of those record keeping requirements. Maintaining receipts, invoices, or any other documentation to show the transactions that occurred. So having evidence of the expenditures. And then again, the minimum retention period, I don't think I actually covered this, so I won't say again, but I said that there was a requirement. Typically, it's 3 years from the submission of your final report on a grant. You are required to maintain those records. So at any time, the agency can come back to you because they're being audited and say, I need to get this information from you. You're required to have that for them. And then we can talk a little bit about financial tracking, specifically for tracking time and effort. So this is for personnel costs. So you want to have detailed records of the personnel's time spent on the grant. So typically you would use a timekeeping software. Again, you can do this in any way that makes sense to you, like an Excel document could work, but essentially you want to have somebody saying, okay, on this day, I spent this many hours working on this project. So making sure that somebody's tracking their time, everyone's tracking their time, essentially, if you're working on grants. It should be really clear to go back and see how many hours that somebody works so that you can charge that. And then adding that layer of certification. So the employee goes back, confirms what they had reported on the hours that they spent on the grant, and then their supervisor can sign off on that, and then that can be then the final hours worked. So usually those occur bi-weekly. You might already be doing this. Again, this could be super basic, but it's not something that we always see happening with our grantees. And so I think it's important reminder. Our NACD does this bi-weekly. It's in a software. We go in and just enter our hours up to, the total 80 hours for the 2 weeks to show what projects that we worked on. The pieces you would have the name of the person, the position, and then what grant that they're working on, what dates it will covered, and then how many hours that they worked on each grant, and then finally that certification. And then we can talk a little bit about matching contributions. So this is kind of another hot button topic I get a lot of questions about. So matching contributions for federal grants are the non-federal funds or in-kind resources that supplement the federal funds. So it's a way for you to demonstrate your commitment to the project, and it also leverages the federal funding to have a greater impact. So there's 2 types of matching contributions, either cash, which is just direct monetary contributions, or in-kind services, goods or facilities. So somebody either volunteering their time, lending their equipment, lending their space. So any kind of donation of services that is not just cash would be under in-kind. Allowability of match, it has similar requirements to the allowability of costs in your budget with grant funds. They need to be necessary, reasonable, allocable, and they need to be documented as well. So if you're reporting on match, you need to also document it the same way, essentially, that you're documenting your expenditures. And it needs to be shown to be directly benefiting the project. To value your matching contributions, it should be fair market value for the goods or services. There's standard rates for volunteer services that you can find, the federal government. I believe they have a national rate. There might also be state by state rates, but just justifying that in some way. So, for example, volunteer picking up trash, you'd probably use the standard rate. Volunteer pro bono legal services, you could use their regular rate, but you just need to be able to justify that. So you don't want to have something like you're claiming that it's worth like way more than it actually would be if you just were to purchase it. So it should just be equal to what it would be if you were going to spend money on it, essentially. Again, compliance following the uniform guidance, the specific section here is 306, and then also your grant agreement, which will have more specific requirements as well. So grant agreement comes first, and then uniform guidance is kind of like the fallback if that information is not available in your agreement. Again, tracking, using a detailed budget, maintaining records, maintaining documentation. So timesheets could still be applicable if you're donating time to the grant rather than using grant funding to fund personnel. Maybe someone's donating their time, making sure you're still tracking that in the same way, receipts, and then justification for how you're valuing the match. So I just had an example here, a $10,000 donation from a private entity, or an in-kind match could be 200 volunteer hours at $25 an hour, valued at $5,000. Okay, that's kind of my whole spiel about some basics. Please let me know if you have questions. I am going to pass it over to Erin. She is the district manager for Deschutes Soil and Water Conservation District. I hope I said that right.
Yeah, you did.
Erin Kilcullen. So she's going to give you some examples of how they do some tracking on their grants. So I will stop sharing my screen for now.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining. As Chloe said, I'm Erin Kilcullen. I'm the district manager for Deschutes Soil and Water Conservation District. So we're located in Central Oregon. And I love the NACD grants. I don't know if anybody's had them, but We have a lot of different varieties of grants, and these are very straightforward. Their reporting is very simple. Their applications are simple. I love them. So I've been the manager for 4 years. We've had 3 NACD TA grants, and we've had 2 urban and community grants. So I was going to put together a spreadsheet, but I thought it would be more simple just to share my screen of how I track these different grants. So I'll just start with showing, let me see, let me share. I'm going to share a couple different screens and I'll explain them as I go through. So this is, for example, this is one TA grant we've had in the past, or I think this might be our current one. So when you do your application for the TA grant and you get your award, you'll have a grant agreement. And then for the TA grants, they send you this budget worksheet. And this is where I start my budgeting and my spreadsheets and everything in QuickBooks. So it shows what you applied for and what was awarded. So the NACD grants, this is what you were awarded. And then it also shows what you applied for and was going to provide in match. So for this grant, we only are supplying in-kind match and we had no cash match. So our salaries and fringe, which is all of our staff working on this grant, is $84,000. Training for our staff or for specifics of the grant was $1,000. Materials and supplies, $0. Travel, this was used for our staff members, and we go by the state rate of Oregon, which currently is 0.67 per mile spent. We do not have business vehicles, so we all drive our own personal cars and track our mileage. And then the administration, which is also the indirect that Chloe was talking about, is 10% of your total ask on the grant. So if you add up all your different categories and then you take 10%, is $4,125 for a total of $90,625. And then for these TA grants, minimum match is 20%. And so we had $25,125. So I just wanted to show that. And so I will take these numbers and I'll put them into Excel spreadsheets, and that's what I'll show you next. And I have a couple different spreadsheets. I'm going to show you our urban and community grants because they're a little bit more exciting. Our TA grants, as you just saw, is mainly just our staff working on the grants. So let me show you these. So this is our current urban and community grant, and we're working for this grant. We're working with community gardens throughout Deschutes County. So we're working with 4 community gardens, and the total funding of this grant is $34,576. And this needs a little bit of updating, but our funds to date and then our funds remaining. So I am the manager of the district, and I'm more providing admin for this grant, and my time on this grant is match. And my coworker, Jenna, she is the main manager of this grant. So she put together this really fancy spreadsheet. And then this is how these grant funds are broken down. So we have our salary benefits, and this is $19,602. So that is funding Jenna's time working on this grant. And then for travel is $655. So that's for Jenna and mine travel to any of the community gardens, meetings, workshops. Anytime we're traveling to and from the office or our homes for purposes of this grant, we track out of that $655. And then we broke up. So we had a total of $3,152 for materials and supplies. And then Jenna, she broke it down over the different workshops we're having. So we have 3 different workshops. And then we had a shelter rental, and then seeds, soil, and garden maintenance for these different workshops. So that's how that's broken down. And then we also had a contracting category within this grant. So the 3 different gardens are doing different projects that are getting funded. And then we broke that down of how those are each getting funded. And then we also hired a contractor that works for Bend Urban Gardens, and she's a presenter that we have for this garden. And then the total here, and then the 10% admin and direct costs is the $3,143. So that's how we broke down the grant, and then I'll show you how I track everything in my different spreadsheets. And there is a lot of spreadsheets, and I'm happy to answer questions and work more offline on all of these. So I will start with our grant funding. So I showed you that first table, which was for a TA grant, but I do a similar thing for urban and community grant. And in addition to these individual spreadsheets, I also have one massive Excel spreadsheet that has all of our grants as a district, and then different spreadsheets that compile all of that and how we budget our time over different months. So this grant is the urban and community grant, is a total of 16 months. And so I took all of the staff salaries, wages, and benefits, which is 19,602. And as Chloe said, I'm not going to go into details of all this, but we do monthly payroll. And so every month, all of my staff sends in timesheets, and they specify their time worked, details of what they're working on, and then what grant that is working on. I also, for my purposes, for budgeting, I like to look at the time frame of the grant. So this grant was 16 months, and we had $19,602. And I break that evenly over that 16 months, and it comes out to an average of about 35 hours of Jenna working on this grant. And so it's going to be a give and take monthly on that, but I try to just tell my staff, this is what I have budgeted for you. And so so that they know how to allocate their time, because as you know, working with grants, your time is over. It could be 2 grants, it could be 10 grants. So I really like my staff to know how many hours they should be approximately spending on each grant. And as you can see here, 1 month she spent 35 hours, the next month she spent 48 hours. So just trying to get an average of 35 hours for budgeting purposes, because I just want to make sure that we're utilizing all of this funding over the time frame of the grant. Because if you don't utilize your grant money, you have to send it back, and that's no fun. So this is, and especially the NACD grants, they're meant to increase capacity for conservation districts. So I really want to make sure that we're utilizing that funding. So I took that budget worksheet, and then I created this spreadsheet, and we have an organization in Bend that is really good at sending all these spreadsheets. So I kind of just duplicate this for every single grant that we utilize. So in the column, so you'll have at the top, you'll have the name of the grant, who the grantee is, and then the dates of the grant, so the timeline of it. And then you have a date column, a vendor name, invoice number, if there are invoice numbers, or just details of what you're spending your money on, and then all the different categories of the grant. So this grant, we have salary, wages, and benefits, contractual, materials and supplies, travel, admin, and then totals. And this should total that budget worksheet that I showed previously for every grant that you have. And then you track. So I track my staff time and every single purchase for every single grant monthly. So for example, for August, Jenna worked 35 hours and she has her hourly rate, which is not shown here. And we have a bookkeeper that does payroll, and our bookkeeper does an amazing job. She breaks out every single month, every one of our hours into different grants. So in QuickBooks, it is all tracked very cleanly and amazing. It's still a work in progress. I'm not going to show you my QuickBooks because that's just a whole nother confusing avenue. So this is how I personally track it. And I am doing all the reporting for all the grants. And so this really helps me when I have all my quarter reports. And how I track my admin is, everyone does this different. I've asked a lot of different conservation districts, nonprofits, and every quarter, so this is, for example, July through September of 23, I take 10% admin of what we spent during that quarter. Because the admin, the indirect cost is 10% of your total grant. And that is how I track it for what was spent in that quarter. NACD is a little different than other grants. They do quarter installments versus all of our other grants, we have to do payment request. So for other grants, this is a lot easier when I'm actually requesting the money to make sure that I'm getting that administrative cost reimbursed to us. And I track this separately, which I'm not going to show you, but I have an admin indirect table, and that shows all of our districts' indirect costs. So it'll show office supplies. It can show our audit, our bookkeeper, everything that Chloe described that can be utilized for indirect cost is in a category in QuickBooks that we pull from and add to with each grant. And so instead of going into detail, I just show 10% admin. And there's different ways of doing this. I find this is just more straightforward to me, and it shows money coming in and money going out for each grant. And then as you go down, you can see November, we bought garden boxes for our community garden. It shows a lot of staff time. It shows in April, Bend Urban Gardens, which is a hired contractor. She sent us a bill for $525. As Chloe said, make sure you're keeping all of those invoices. I do that all on my personal computer, and we use OneDrive as a district. And so for every single grant, I have an invoices receipts folder that I'm keeping track of all of that. And so yeah, every single month, keep track of every purchase and everything spent on the grant. And then as you move down, so here it'll show your receipt totals for the whole grant up to date. And it'll calculate each column. So I put in different equations for this. So the sums of everything that was spent in each category, and then the remaining budget totals. So this will subtract the total for each category that you were awarded, and it'll subtract what you have spent so far, and that'll show you what's remaining for the grant. So for this grant, we have $19,000, $769 remaining. And I monthly, when I do payroll and our books and monthly financials, I am, as Chloe said, I am checking this monthly to make sure we are on track to utilize all of those funds by October 31st of 24, which is when this grant's completed. And then I was going to also show you, this is our match. So I do the same thing for match, same spreadsheet, everything. And I have this in a spreadsheet for each grant. So it'll show the grant fund tracking and the match fund tracking. And for this grant, we had each community garden and a partner organization environmental center. This is what they, during the application, said that they had available for match. So same grant. And then at the time, I guess when we applied, we did not submit any match for Deschutes SWCD. But then as I'm moving forward with this grant, I'm utilizing my time as match, and Jenna's just, she's spending all of her time on the specifics of the grant. And as Chloe said, we use the state of Oregon rates. So we have the Bureau of Oregon Labor that sets out every year, they set out a whole sheet of different labor costs. And so we do $25 an hour. So all of the employees, they're not employees of these community gardens, they're all volunteers. So every hour that they work on this grant, which has been a lot, they're receiving $25 an hour, and that is as in kind for this match. So we got no cash contributions, so it is all match. And I am also, I've been tracking this and match quarterly, and that is for purposes of this grant. So I'm just keeping track of every meetings we had, and then every match partner is also sending me invoices quarterly of their time spent on this grant. And then I'm taking those invoices and keeping track of them here. And as well as my time. So same thing, I'm showing each category at the top, what everyone specified as match, tracking it quarterly. And then at the bottom, it's showing me how much is remaining. And you want to make sure for your quarter reports that you're providing enough match, which is 20% of each grant. I think some might be 25, but I'm not positive, Chloe. But so we still have to spend $3,674 in match by the end of October. And that's how I track everything for every grant. And then I was just going to show you some examples of our reports that we showed of how this. Also, I think when you receive any grant, NCDEA or outside, look at their reporting requirements, because that's going to help you set up your spreadsheet and make your life a lot easier when you have to do your quarter reports. Some grants that we have, they need details on how many landowners did you contact, how many projects. So we also, as a district, set up a whole metrics tab of, because I need to know what my staff is doing on a daily basis. How many landowner contacts are you making? How many projects are we working with? How many conservation plans? And so we do a whole nother spreadsheets, and that's all on a shared drive that we use as staff for them to track what they're actually doing on a month-to-month basis, and in addition to their time spent on each grant, so details of what their time spent doing. And so I'll just show for really quickly, I know we're cutting short on time. I was just going to show an example of a couple quarter reports. So this is our most recent urban and community reports. And like I said, I think it's really important to look at what you need to specify for the reports before you start your tracking. So the NACD urban and community, they're a little bit different than the TA grants. They're a little more general. I'd say the TA grants need a little bit more specific details. So this is the report that you have to fill out quarterly. So you have to describe your grant activities specifically, and then number of clients reached. So make sure you're keeping track of that. Any partner organizations. And then it goes into your cost. So NACD funds. So how much salaries and benefits. So when you get to this tab, I can easily go to my spreadsheet and I can do a quick sum of how much my coworker Jenna spent working on this grant during this quarter. You just add up 3 different cells in Excel. And then for this quarter, we didn't have any travel cost. We spent $1,056 in contractor cost, no materials and supplies. And then we had $356 of administrative cost. And then it goes down into match. So it's asking you the same thing. So you go to your match spreadsheet and how much salaries and benefits, and then the details on this. So for this quarter, I just had 1,800 in contractors and 300 in administrative, which was my time. And then it'll keep track of your match here. And then it asks for details. So I go to my spreadsheet, and my program and operations coordinator, she worked 93 hours at $26 an hour. And then details of what was constructed. So that was materials and supplies. And then they want details on how you spent your match. And then I will also show you, so the TA grants are a little different. So they ask for an accomplishments report and then a financial report. Sorry, it's not letting me show. Okay, so I'll go through the accomplishments tab. And so this was the most recent. Oh no, this is year 23. But this one asks more details on what your technical assistance was. So here it shows number of quota contacts, how many would qualify as underserved. And so these are, you really want to look at what your grant is asking in a quarter report, because that's really going to provide you with a lot of information of what you need to be tracking for each grant, or else you're going to get to your quarter report and not have any of these details. So here it's asking for contacts, number of plans worked on, plans completed, and then a narrative on what was accomplished during that grant. So I'm not going to go into details, but this is our narrative. And then I was going to show, and then this is the TA financial report. And so they are quarterly. So this is our most current quarterly from end of March 2024. And the NACD grants, they do give you 20 days to finish your reports after the quarter. So the quarter ends. So this quarter is going to end in 4 days. And then you have until July 20th to complete your reports, which is really great because that gives me time to get our June timesheets into our bookkeeper. It gives her time to get everything in QuickBooks, and it gives me time to see how much of our payroll was spent on each grant. And then I can put that into our spreadsheets and then do our reports. And another thing, what I've learned, and I am always learning, I think. I mean, when I started 4 years ago, I had no idea how to do any of this. And I think I spend like days every single month working on spreadsheets and making them more efficient, because at the end of the day, they're benefiting me and making my life a lot easier and making sure that I'm reporting in compliance with all these grants. And then this past year, we had to do our first full audit. So you really want to make sure that you're keeping track of everything, because that auditor is going to do random polls of, I need March 2021 timesheet. And then he needs to show that timesheet and the specifics in your QuickBooks that this employee was working X amount of hours on this grant, and it needs to be represented in QuickBooks. So you really want to do a good job of tracking everything. So not only do you need to know how many hours they spent, but how much their hourly rate is, and then how much their hours equivalent to how much they spent on each grant. So this one is asking for grant funded staff hours, match funded staff hours, total hours of staff and contractors, how many are certified planners. And we do pretty much all in-kind match for these grants. So we spent $5,300 on in-kind salaries. And then it goes into how much you spent specifically on the grant. So for that quarter. And then it's asking how much of your staff time was providing technical assistance, either for EQIP, CSP, or CODA funds. And we're mainly working with CODA funds for this TA grant and some CSP funds. And yeah, these TA grants are a little bit more specific. And I will stop there. And that was a lot of spreadsheets, but I thought it was easier just to share everything. So it's very complicated, but I'm happy to talk offline more about this as well.
Yeah, I thought that was awesome. If you could maybe just send me a couple of screenshots, Erin, we'll post some things together, and then your contact info if folks are
Okay, great.
interested. And I will put that with the presenter materials when we load everything up on the website. So if they do want to reach out and be like, hey, how do we do this? Or how do you set that up? They'll have your contact info. So great job, ladies. We had a couple of questions. I know Chloe said she was going to answer one because she saw, so I'll let you do that first. And then we have a couple more related to forms and some details.
Yeah, and I have a couple more slides too, just to go over some of the grant opportunities at NACD if we still have time.
Yeah, perfect. If you can do it kind of quick so we can get a couple questions in. I know one of the questions was about grant opportunities, so yeah.
Yes, I saw that. So yeah, I'll answer the question first that I saw regarding the matching contributions. There was a question about using admin and payroll hours as volunteer hours for grant match. You have to determine if the hours are considered indirect or direct costs on the grant to figure out how you'll charge that as match. So if it's administrative hours that are direct costs, like submitting, completing and submitting reports, then you could use that as payroll costs as match. So personnel costs as matching contributions for the hours that they spend working on the grant reports. That's just one example. But again, it has to be, if it's a personnel cost, it has to be direct work on the grant, whether you're requesting NACD funds or federal funds for that cost, or whether you're claiming it as match. If you'd like to use indirect costs as match, so if you have, payroll staff that you would be, that would be considered an indirect cost that you would like to use as match, you can do that. It has to be unclaimed indirect. So if you're not requesting indirect from NACD, then you can request indirect as match, but it has to still fall in those. I didn't go over this when I talked about match, and maybe I should briefly just say, because Erin touched on it. If you're taking, there's different rates you can take on your indirect. If you don't have a negotiated cost rate agreement with the federal government to take in a specific indirect rate, you would take the 10% de minimis rate. And there are some rules around how you apply that 10%. I tried to share it in the chat. We have a link to an indirect cost policy, but I don't think it goes to the whole group. It said it was only going to hosts and panelists. So I'm not sure how I can share that with the group. But NACD does have an indirect cost policy, but it essentially just follows the rules of uniform guidance. So if you want more information on how to apply that de minimis 10% rate to your grant. You can find that in the uniform guidance, or you can look for NACD's indirect rate, or you can reach out to me and I can give you more information.
And Chloe, I mean, in Oregon, I think SWCD is already qualified for that 10%.
Everyone gets the 10%. So
Oh, okay,
anyone
gotcha.
can take the 10%.
It's
If you
the
want
higher
to
one,
take
okay.
more than 10%, you're required to have a negotiated indirect
Gotcha.
cost rate
Okay.
agreement to do that. Yeah. So the 10% is for everyone. Of course, programs can say we don't accept indirect or we won't pay indirect. That's like a base, like program to program. For any CD grants, we do allow that 10%. So anybody can take that. There's just some rules about where you apply the 10%. And I don't want to get into those weeds, but it's not always a flat 10% of the total. There's certain costs that you can't apply the rate to. Like if you purchase equipment, you cannot apply indirect to the equipment costs. But for personnel, you can do 100% of the personnel costs. You can take 10%. Anyway, that's all to say is if you're going to use match, indirect cost as match, it has to be unclaimed indirect. So if the most you can take is 10%, then you can only claim up to 10% of your indirect as match. And that would mean that you're not asking NACD for any indirect. And I know that's confusing. Anybody who wants to reach out and kind of talk through any of these questions with me, I'm happy to help on a case-by-case basis because it is a little tricky. Just really quick, because there was a question about other opportunities. I just wanted to say that all this is available on the website. If you go on the website, there's a little drop-down menu for what we do. And then each page has its own kind of information on each grant. Somebody had asked about grant forms, and thank you, Sarah. She shared that link in the questions for with NACD's indirect policy. Somebody asked about the grant forms. If there's not an open application, you can find basic information on the website. You might be able to find past requests for proposals, but there won't be any current information about a current application if it's not open. I want to go over this really quickly. I won't get into too much detail, but the technical assistance grants will be opening soon for 2024. EPA is currently open. It's only for certain regions because it's supposed to be benefiting the Gulf of Mexico. But we do have an open EPA grant, and it's open on a rolling basis. So you can apply to that if you're in one of those regions. That's open rolling until we spend all the money, and there's no match requirement for that one. So that's one benefit. Urban grants, there will be an RFP opening in the fall. So that usually closes in the spring of the following year. So it just recently closed this spring, but there will be another RFP opening for the urban grants in the fall. And then there is also the Friends of NACD grants that are small grants, but they're very like unrestricted. So they're really kind of like starter grants for smaller outreach projects. And that will also, like I think I said, will also be opening in the fall. So that's like a really brief overview of what we have. Let's see. Here's my contact info, and I'll just go through and see if there's other questions I can answer in the next couple minutes. Somebody asked about doing an overview about tracking time in QuickBooks. That would probably be a whole nother presentation. Even to keep it simple, I don't think I can go over that right now, but
yeah, that's a technical one. QuickBooks does have a timekeeping option though, and you can just like go to QuickBooks to like QuickBooks Online or whatever it is, and in their learning centers, they have some really good videos and tutorials on how you can use it. So if you're already using QuickBooks, you can access it that way. I did make a note of that maybe that's a future topic where we can get into some higher level overviews of some of those types of things. So yeah, so that's on the list for a future webinar, but I would look at their online section, and it goes through how you can use time to track projects, to track customers, to all kinds of things. You can get really detailed in QuickBooks if you want to with your timekeeping. Let's see,
Thank you.
match, here's another match question, Chloe. Can you count office space as match? And if so, how do you value it?
So you can't just count the rental space as match unless the rental space is used solely for the grant. And you would have to justify why that rental space is necessary to complete the outcomes of the project if you want to make that a direct cost. Otherwise, the office space typically would fall under indirect, and that would be like a rental cost that's under indirect. So like your overhead cost is the rent for your office space. So that would fall again into that 10%. If you're using the de minimis, in most cases, that's the case, not that organizations do not have a negotiated cost rate agreement to use a higher rate. And so then you would just include that as part of the 10%. And if you were not requesting funds to pay for indirect, then you could claim the unclaimed indirect as match. So that's how you would do that. And it's definitely tricky, but it would be part of your indirect costs. So you could claim indirect as match. You wouldn't have to specify what the indirect covers necessarily, but that's where the rental costs would fall.
I'm gonna get Chloe to come back with like a whiteboard and draw on it and give us some more in depth on what counts and what doesn't. We'll do
Yeah,
a grants 201, Chloe, and you can get way in the weeds with some of this stuff. 'Cause
yeah,
we
I'd be
know
happy to
it
just
can
have
be,
an open question and
yeah,
answer.
it can be so confusing sometimes.
It
So
really,
another one for you, Chloe. What advice can you provide? And Erin too, because you've been a successful awardee of grants. So what advice can you provide relating to applying for the grants? Like what would make someone, more appealing to the grant review committee? What tips and tricks, Erin, do you have in terms of like filling out the grant, the applications, reviewing the request for a proposal, that kind of stuff?
yeah, so I would say that just understanding what are the requirements for the grant and making sure that your project fits those priorities. You don't want to like shoehorn something in. And if you're not sure, reach out to me, reach out to the programs team at NACD, because you can kind of give me a rundown of, hey, this is the project I'm thinking of. Do you think this fits? Before you start spending time putting together an application, I can kind of give you more insight as to whether it'll be a good fit. So making sure that you are matching up with the priorities of the grant, I think is probably the best advice I can give. So you can reach out to me and we can talk through ideas and stuff like that. Also, I would say the one thing that I noticed that it is often overlooked, this is just like my own personal thought, is just that gives an application an edge, is having some kind of sustainability plan. So like, how are you going to sustain this outcomes of this project past the grant period, so that we know that this investment is really going to like stand the test of time. I don't see that very often. And so when I do see that in a project, it definitely makes it stand out for me. So that's just my own kind of tidbit, but.
Yeah. How about you, Erin? Do you have any tips,
Yeah,
tricks, advice?
so I think the TA and the urban and community are very different. So
Yes.
for our TA grant, I think what's made us successful is we have a great relationship with NRCS. We're in the same office. And so that TA grant is our staff providing time to assist NRCS with their equip contracts and contacts and getting projects on the ground. And so for us, since we've had 3 TA grants, I think it just continues our momentum. Like Chloe said, it's an ongoing program. So NRCS is receiving federal funding to get projects on the ground, but in order to get those projects on the ground, they need assistance from us. So just being specific of details of what projects you're assisting NRCS with, what you're doing on the ground. So our staff we're doing outreach to landowners, we're doing site visits, we're helping them with the application, with the whole program. Do they qualify, step-by-steps? And that's all our staff helping NRCS with that. And then just providing details of what that technical assistance is providing. So what projects are you getting on the ground? What are you doing? So here in Central Oregon, we do a lot of irrigation efficiency projects and forest health improvement projects. So just really providing as much detail as you can, getting partners on that. So I thought the TA was a little not vague, vague's not the right word. It's a little more open, where I think the urban and community is the opposite. You want to be specific, you want partners, you want detailed. Well, I am doing X, Y, and Z, and this is how I'm accomplishing X, Y, and Z. And this is how, like Chloe said, we're going to sustain that into the future. So I think the urban and community is a little bit more challenging than the TA from my point of view. I know our first urban and community, we were ranked last. And so we had to go back and redo the budget. So we weren't awarded our full request, but we were able to rework the budget and work with a little bit less funding and rework the project. So just get partners, get letters of support, and just have as much detail of what you're going to accomplish with that grant.
That's great advice. Having reviewed some of those grants with NACD on their committees, I would say the same thing to what Chloe and Erin have both said. Like, be very detailed, be specific, like really get clear on what you're doing. Visit with NACD. Their staff is fantastic. They want to help you, so reach out to them. Reach out to districts in your area, in your state, that have done them too, because that's a really great way to kind of get some of that, especially if you've never done one. Like, help me just get started, or even, what do you think of this idea? There's a lot of resources out there. So I think those are really great pieces of advice. Let's see, I think let's do 2 more quick ones. Holly had a question about the next RFP. I think Chloe kind of answered that with some of them are coming up, some of them have closed for the year. I would recommend signing up for NACD's email lists, because they always put them in their news brief that they send out. And as a sidebar, they usually announce those. So that's a really great way. They oftentimes announce other ones too for partners. So that's a great way to kind of keep up with what's going on. So sign up to their listserv. And let's see here. One kind of final question. And this talks a little bit about like crossing funding sources and that goes into tracking, I think, a little bit. So if a district is part of their duties is assisting NRCS in any way, and they bill that through a farm bill funding source, does that prevent them from receiving a grant?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I would say it does not prevent you, but we always have to make sure that we're not double counting work. So if you're counting an outcome on a project for a farm bill project, then you can't count that on another grant. So you can't say that the number of producers that you reach for one project, also you reach those producers for a different project. It has to be very distinct, like separate outcomes, separate funding, unless you're using match or leverage, which typically you're not using another federal source to match with another federal source. So just making sure that you're not double counting work, you're not double counting hours, you're not double counting any kind of expenditures or outcomes on 2 different projects. It doesn't mean you can't get an NACD grant if you have other grants. It just means that you have to be even more careful with your tracking to keep those separate.
Yeah, and that's where you can pay Erin to set up all your spreadsheets, because she looks like a master.
That's a new way of getting money for the district.
Absolutely, you can contract that out. I would probably hire you, honestly. I do not like spreadsheets.
Oh yeah, it's a long process, so don't get discouraged. It takes years.
All right, ladies, thank you so much for everyone still listening in on the call. I will get this recorded, or get the recording downloaded, and I will do my best to have it up by the end of the week on the website ncdea.us. And just thanks a lot. We'll look at doing a grants 201. So keep that in the back of your mind, Chloe, and we can get into some of the most detailed things. It's always tough in an hour to get everything in. And I took away some other topics for future webinars, and we would invite you next month to join us for thinking outside the box as far as funding your district and adding capacity through programs and employees. So thank you all so much. Hopefully we'll see you next week, or next month, excuse me. Erin, Chloe, great job. Thanks a lot. We appreciate you joining us today, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.